Welcome, everyone, to Paycheck. I can't even speak today. Paycheck Protection Program Forgiveness for Churches. This is sponsored by the Holston Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. If you are not a part of Holston, you are still welcome, and there may be things that you will benefit from today, certainly, but just be aware that this is geared specifically for Holston churches within the United Methodist Church. So some of the language that I use today, some of the ways in which we talk about things are going to relate specifically to the way that we do things in our churches here in this annual conference. But again, that doesn't mean that there will not be benefit for people from other places as well. So welcome. If you're not a part of Holston, welcome. This is a webinar put on by the Council on Finance and Administration of the Holston Annual Conference, of which I am a member. Today, this is copyrighted material, so just be aware of that. You're welcome to use it within your churches. You're even welcome to spread it around to other churches. I don't have any problem with that, but please don't put it out on the internet or use it as your own presentation somewhere. For those of you that do not know me, there's something in the slides about who I am, but basically, I am a bivocational pastor. And in addition to being a local pastor within the United Methodist Church, I also am a tax professional and fairly well known at the national level. I teach all over the country and am a part of several working groups with the IRS and industry. And so all of that just to say that I do this professionally. Having said that, the Paycheck Protection Program is actually less of an IRS thing and more of an SBA or Small Business Administration thing. So I am not a part of working groups that are actually implementing this particular piece of it that we're talking about today. But I have a lot of experience reading laws, reading regulations, and figuring out how we put those into practice. That's a lot of what I do. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about maximizing forgiveness. That's our ultimate goal in what we talk about today. But we're going to organize that in terms of what do we know from the CARES Act, which is the law itself. What do we know from the interim final rule? These are the set of regulations that have come down from the Department of Treasury. And then what do we know from the frequently asked questions that have been posted by the Small Business Administration? And what do we know from the forgiveness application and instructions? So the forgiveness application was released late in the afternoon, early evening on May the 15th. So it's a fairly new document, a little less than a week old since that was released. We're also going to look at how do I recommend we deal with our bookkeeping entries for items included in the Paycheck Protection Program and for the loans. So we're going to briefly talk about that. And then we'll also deal with your questions, and I will answer as many of those as we possibly can. So with that said, we are going to go ahead and dive in. I will caution you that I will issue some polling questions from time to time during the presentation today. And I'm going to issue the first one of those polling questions now. There's not a right or wrong answer per se, just be truthful. But this just helps me to know who is on our webinar today and helps me to be able to fashion it in a way that hopefully is helpful. So this question, very simple. Are you a clergy person, a church treasurer, church finance chair, church administrative council chair, lay leader, bookkeeper, outside accountant, or other? That will just help me to know who we have with us today. I will also mention as you're filling this out that if you are a part of Holston, the Wesley Leadership Institute has approved today's webinar for 0.1 CEUs, and I will automatically send that information to Sue so that she can record that, but be aware of that as well. I'll give you about another 10 seconds or so to answer the polling question, and then we will dive straight into our material today. All right, so the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, that's what we commonly refer to as the CARES Act. It was actually signed by the president on March 27th of 2020, and I gave you the public law number there. You don't need to overly worry about the rest of this, other than I've given you for reference what are the section numbers in case you want to go look any of this up. But here's what we really know from this that will be helpful to you. And that is, what are the allowable uses for the funds that come as a part of the Paycheck Protection Program loans? This is in the law itself. Well, it says that we can use it for payroll costs. It says that we can use it for costs that are related to the continuation of group health care benefits during periods of paid sick, medical, or family leave and insurance premiums. It also says that we're going to include employee salaries, commissions, or similar compensations. And it says that we're going to include the payments of interest on any mortgage obligation, but not the principal payment. So the interest only on mortgage. And it also includes rent payments. It also includes utility payments. And in terms of allowable uses for the funds, we can also use interest on any other debt obligations that were incurred before the covered period. However, I want to caution you because that last part, although it is an allowable use of the funds, is not something that will be forgiven. So be aware of that. There's a slight variation in the allowable uses and what we will actually be able to get forgiven. We'll be talking through that as we continue on today. I want to define payroll cost as defined in the law itself, because it's important that we understand what is a part of the law, and then we'll understand what we learn from each of these various stages as we move through. So payroll cost is the sum of any payments of any compensation with respect to an employee that is a salary, a wage, a commission, or a similar compensation. It also would include the payment of cash tips or equivalent, and it would also include payment for leave, whether that's vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick leave. It also could include any sort of allowance for dismissal or separation, and it also includes the payments for the provision of group health care benefits. Now, let me pause here. I have had a few churches ask me, what if we reimburse our staff for their individual health plan cost? And the answer to that is not an allowable use under the Paycheck Protection Program, and that would not be eligible for forgiveness. What is eligible is if you are a part of a group health plan. So for those of us in the Holston Conference, that means that you are a part of the Holston Conference health plan that is administered by Blue Cross and Blue Shield, but we are self-insured in the Holston Conference. Also, the payment of any retirement benefit. This is going to include the direct billed pension portion and the payment of state or local tax assessed on the compensation of employees. So if you are in a situation, and most of our churches are not, but if you're in a situation where you are paying unemployment or that sort of thing, that would also be included in payroll cost. The sum of any payments of any compensation cannot exceed $100,000 in a year to be eligible for forgiveness. So we do have some employees that may be over $100,000, particularly in some of our larger churches or our district superintendents, that sort of thing. So if you have wages that are above $100,000 annualized, we're only going to get credit for the first $100,000 out of the PPP. And we'll talk more about that as we move through. So continuing to talk about payroll costs, let's talk about what is not included. Well, as we just mentioned, the compensation of an individual employee that is in excess of a salary of $100,000 is prorated for the covered period. So I have had probably 10 or 12 emails that have come and said, hey, Knox, we have employees that are above $100,000. Does that mean we cannot include those employees at all? And the answer to that is you could still include those employees. You're just not going to get credit for the portion that is above $100,000 prorated, which is $15,385. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Taxes imposed or withheld under chapters 21, 22, or 24 of the Internal Revenue Code. And I know most of you, your minds just blew and said, Knox, I have no clue what's in those chapters. So let me help you out. This is the employer side of FICA. So not the employee side, but the employer side of FICA. So that includes our Social Security or Medicare, all those sorts of things. The employer side is not something that is going to be forgiven out of PPP. Now, the employee side is, because that's a part of gross payroll. Any compensation for an employee whose principal place of residence is outside of the United States. So if you happen to have a missionary who is outside of the United States for their principal place of residence, then it's not going to qualify for them. But note that the key here is, where is their principal place of residence? And then the other thing is qualified sick leave wages for which a credit was already received under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And in a previous webinar, we went over some of what that is, so I'm not going to focus on that today. Or likewise, the family leave wages that are under the FFCRA. What about covered rent obligations? Well, this means rent that is under a leasing agreement that existed prior to February 15th. So you can't just go suddenly say, hey, we want to go rent a shed or something. No, it has to be a leasing agreement that was in effect before February 15 in order to qualify for forgiveness. And there's going to be an 8-week period that begins on the date of the origination of the covered loan. Now, that's what the law said. We're going to get more clarity about how to define that 8-week period as we move through the webinar today. Remember, at the moment, we're talking about what the law itself said. So for forgiveness, you're eligible for forgiveness of the indebtedness on a covered loan in an amount equal to the sum of the following costs incurred and the payments made. The payroll cost, the payment of any mortgage interest, but again, not principal, and the payment of any rent obligation, as well as any covered utility payment. This amount is going to be reduced by certain things that we have to pay attention to. And one of those things is the number of full-time equivalent employees that we have. So we have to look at our 2019 numbers, or we have to look at our February 15 numbers. And there's a couple of different ways that we have to look at this. But the short answer is we have to run a bunch of different places where what was our number of full-time equivalent employees. Basically, you need to know this for every month or every pay period, technically, in 2019, as well as the period January 1 through February 15 of 2020. And then you're also going to need to know what was the number of full-time equivalents that you had for each of your pay periods during the covered period, and what was the number of full-time equivalents that you had on June 30. All of those are things that we need to know as we are completing the forgiveness application. If that sounds daunting to you, thankfully, in most churches, we don't have a ton of turnover. And so we don't have a ton of variance here. You may have had the same number of employees the entire year in 2019. You may have had a slight variance a month or two if you brought somebody on or you had a change of position or something. But for the most part, in most of our churches, this is not a huge variance. So don't let this be too daunting to you. We could also choose the average number of full-time equivalent employees per month employed by the eligible during the period beginning on February 15 and ending on June 30 if we call ourselves a seasonal employer. Now, this would apply to our camps, for example, but is not going to apply to most of our churches. And we are going to take the average number of full-time equivalent employed by the period between January 1 and February 29. And then in the case of a seasonal employer, as I mentioned, it's a slightly different calculation. But in general, the amount of loan forgiveness under this section is going to be reduced by any reduction that is in excess of 25% of the wages. So let me word that another way. You have to be paying at least 75% of the wages that you were last year. So when you're looking at your 2019 section, then you want to make sure that you had not reduced those employees by more than 25% for that particular position. So, for example, let's pretend that I had a director of music ministry and I was paid, we're just going to use really round numbers. I was paying this director of music ministry $100,000. We lost that director of music ministry, and we decided to hire a new director of music ministry. But this new one, we thought we could pay $50,000. So we paid them $50,000. Do I have a problem? Well, under PPP, I actually do have a problem in this scenario because the reduction in salary is greater than 25%. In this case, it was a 50% reduction in salary. So pay attention to that. We cannot reduce salaries overall by more than 25% for each employee position. So pay attention to that as we are looking at PPP forgiveness. All right. Now, we also, by the way, there's an exception for that for workers that are over 100,000. So you can reduce down to 100,000 all day long, regardless of the percentage of reduction. Tipped workers, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because we don't have a lot of tipped workers in the local church, although we do have a church or two that has a coffee shop, but for the most part, we don't have much of that. Now, there is an exemption for rehires. So, for example, if you laid people off, maybe out of a daycare or something like that, and you laid persons off prior to the CARES Act coming out and prior to having PPP or FFCRA money, then we can bring those people back. And as long as we bring those people back, then we don't get penalized for that. And we have to bring them back by June 30th. So be aware of that. And so the circumstance in this case is a circumstance in which we had a period beginning on February 15 and ending on the date that is 30 days after the enactment of the act. So next obvious question, when was the act enacted? The answer to that is it was enacted on March 27th. So 30 days after March 27. And then we're going to look at that calculation and make sure we rehire those persons no later than June 30. So what we need to make sure that we are doing is that we rehire these persons, like I said, not later than June 30, and we make sure that we are back to the number of full-time equivalents that we had on February 15. So if we laid people off after February 15 and before April 25 or so, then we need to make sure that we rehire those persons for sure prior to June 30. Otherwise, we're going to be subject potentially to a reduction in the number of FTEs, which is full-time equivalents. Now, the other thing we learned from the CARES Act is that the lender, that's the bank, is required to give us a decision on forgiveness in no more than 60 days after the date that we submit the forgiveness application. So we're going to talk a little bit about the interim final rule and see what we learned there as well. And so we'll be doing that in just a moment. But I want to go ahead and open up another polling question here. And this polling question is a pretty simple polling question, simply asking, has your church already received a Paycheck Protection Program loan? Now, if you represent another ministry that's not actually the local church, but another ministry, just pretend that that's what we mean here. I use church because most of our people are in churches. But has your church already received a Paycheck Protection Program loan, true or false? This just helps me to know, for the most part, who is with us today. And we will give you just a moment to answer that. And we do have a couple of questions here. Someone is asking, do we know if loan money is still available for new applications? And Mark, the answer to that is yes. You can still submit an application today. Now, I'm not in today's webinar going to overly talk about that process. However, we do have some recorded webinars from a previous webinar. And you can certainly access that information off of holston.org. Or if you're not sure where that is, email me and I will help you to get that if you need that. But yes, there is money still available. If your church or your ministry has not yet applied for the Paycheck Protection Program and you think that would be helpful to you, then I would strongly encourage you to go ahead and begin that process. Yes, there is still money available. We do have a couple of other questions related to the full-time equivalent, and I'm going to hold off on that. We have a couple of questions about what is a utility. I'm going to hold off on that because I will be answering that. But we have another question that says, our pastor is the only one who receives insurance through the conference. Would that be included in healthcare costs? Yes, it would. That is a group health plan. And so that is going to be a part of the PPP and is eligible for forgiveness in addition to the retirement benefits, which in Holston are through direct billing. So both of those actually are going to show up on direct billing. All right. It looks like, let me get back to this poll and see how we're doing. It looks like about 89% of us have a PPP loan and about 11% of us do not. So there may be some opportunity for several of you to go out there and still apply for this loan. And that I hope will be helpful to you. Someone else is saying, so is the Blue Cross Blue Shield that we pay to the Holston Conference forgivable? And the answer to that is yes. That is part of our group health plan. So that is going to be forgivable. Someone else is asking, is the cash housing allowance resolution of the pastor's compensation forgivable, even though it's not includable in taxable wages? Ivy, the answer to that is yes. And I'm going to cover that, but the housing allowance for the pastor is absolutely an includable expense. That actually came out in the FAQ, which I have included in your handouts. And so if you have a lender giving you trouble about that, I believe it's question 32, but it's in the 30s. There's a question about what about a housing allowance? Is that includable for the Paycheck Protection Program? And is it able to be forgiven? And the answer to that is yes. So, which is consistent with what we taught in our earlier webinars as well. All right, so let's talk about what we learned from the interim final rule. Well, one of the questions that people had is, can the Paycheck Protection Program be forgiven in whole or in part? And the answer to that is yes. The loan forgiveness amount can be up to the full principal and any accrued interest. So if we do everything perfectly, we could actually have the entire thing forgiven, including the interest, which is great. But the good news is it's not an all or nothing. So it is possible to get a portion of it forgiven and not get all of it forgiven as well. And we'll talk more about that as we move through. But do be aware that currently not more than 25% of the loan forgiveness may be attributable to non-payroll costs. So you need to make sure that at least 75% is spent on payroll cost. That should not be too difficult for our churches to do, assuming that we have not reduced our number of persons, right? So assuming that we still have the same number of people, which most of us should, then we should be fine on this because we received funds. We have an 8-week period in which to spend these funds, and we're going to spend that. And then we also get to add to our salaries. We also get to add to that the housing allowances we just discussed. We get to add to that the group health, and we get to add to that the retirement. And all of that is going to be included in this amount. Now, someone else asked me, what about our UMPIP contribution? So for those that don't know what I'm talking about, UMPIP is a 403B plan. It's a retirement plan. This is a voluntary contribution that is made, which means that it is in most cases a payroll deduction. And that means that it is a part of gross payroll. So yes, it too would be included because that's a part of gross payroll. What about our contributions to an HSA or an FSA plan? We offer both of those kind of plans here in the Holston Conference on our health plan as benefits. And yes, those contributions as well. Again, those are typically payroll deductions. And so they're included in gross payroll, and that would be included in the forgiveness. Great questions. All right. Do be aware that independent contractors do not count as employees for the purposes of forgiveness. Now, I highlighted this in a previous webinar, but I want to highlight this again. We should be paying our employees as employees, but sometimes people don't do everything that they should be doing. And just be aware, you do not get rewarded for not doing things the right way. So if you have independent contractors, then they're going to have to go apply on their own. You're not going to be able to pay those independent contractors out of the Paycheck Protection Program. What about if you use the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Grant for payroll? Then you have to include that portion into the PPP, and it's going to be deducted from loan forgiveness. So you just include that. It basically gets refinanced into the PPP. It's going to be deducted from loan forgiveness. And when we look at the loan forgiveness application, you'll see that. All right, let's talk about some clarifications from the frequently asked questions. So when does the 8-week period for forgiveness begin? Well, remember that the CARES Act itself said at the origination of the loan. And there were several people that said, well, what does that mean? Does that mean when the lender gives me an approval? Does that mean when I sign the documents? Does that mean when I receive the funds? Does that mean when I spend the funds? Well, the answer, according to the FAQ, is that it begins on the day of the first disbursement. Now, we're going to get a little bit more leeway that we'll talk about as we move into the forgiveness application. But From the FAQ, it begins on the date of the first disbursement. So that means the day that it hits your bank account. Does a housing allowance provided to an employee count as payroll cost? I actually answered this because it came up as a question, but the answer is yes. Are farmers eligible? The answer is yes. Doesn't overly apply to churches, but somebody asked me on our last one, so I threw it in there. Another question, will a borrower's PPP loan forgiveness amount be reduced if we laid off an employee, offered to rehire the same employee, but the employee declined the offer? So I've had a couple of churches that have contacted me and said, hey, we laid off people in our daycare, but now we've offered to bring them back, but they're making more money through unemployment and they don't want to come back. What do I do? So this is what that's all about. And to qualify for the exception, we must have made a good faith written offer of rehire, and then we have to document the employee's rejection of that offer. And I will give you a heads up that in many cases, it will invalidate them for eligibility for unemployment. So be aware of that, but that's not our problem per se. So if you offer to an employee to come back, make sure that's not over text, that's not just verbally. It must be done in writing, a written offer of rehire, and we're going to document that rejection if they have chosen to reject that. All right. We had a question or two about what are utilities, right? So let's talk about that. So utilities are business payments for a service. And note that I highlighted service because this is important for us to help understand what utilities are. For the distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet access, for which the service began before February 15. So this is going to, in my opinion, this is consistent, by the way. Transportation does include gas that you use for driving your business vehicle. So if you have a church bus or if you have a church van and you're putting gas in those vehicles to go run and pick up people or whatever the case may be, probably not doing a ton of that during this period, but that would be an eligible expense to count under utilities. And I gave you the link. And actually, I didn't provide that in this handout, but I gave you the link here. So if you need to go pull that to see where it says that, then you're able to do that. So that's what utilities are. It's going to be electric. It's going to be gas. It's going to be water. It's going to be transportation. It's going to be telephone, and it's going to be internet access. That's what utilities are. Sewer, I think if you happen to pay sewer on the same thing as a water bill, you're going to be fine including that as well. But transportation is the one that sort of throws people off. And this transportation is about gas that we're using to put in our business vehicles for business purposes. All right. Eligible payroll costs are considered paid on the day paychecks are distributed or that the ACH is originated. But we got some good news here that happened with the application. And that is that payroll, and this is consistent with what I taught earlier, by the way, but payroll cost can be paid or incurred during the 8-week period. So what this means is if we, for example, in my church, we run some of our payroll twice a month and we run some of our payroll once a month, depending on the employee. So for those employees that we run twice a month, we're actually paying typically for what they've worked before, right? So they may have worked the 2 weeks prior, then we pay them a week later, that sort of thing. And that's common in a lot of businesses and churches as well, certainly. And so one of the questions that I was getting is, Knox, that first payroll payment would fall within the period, but the work happened before the period. Can I include that? The answer is yes, because I paid it during the period. But it gets better than that, because at the end of the period, there may be some that has been incurred but not yet paid, because I'm on that every other week cycle, right? So at the end of the period, I have incurred payroll but not yet paid it. That too is going to be eligible for forgiveness as long as I pay it by the next regular payroll date. So this is good news, because it means that during the 8-week period, I can include anything I paid, but also anything incurred, which means for some of our churches, you're actually going to get 9 or 10 weeks of payroll included in the forgiveness covered period, because we're going to be able to, if we manage our payroll just right, this is your normal pattern. If we manage our payroll just right, we're probably paying for a period that ended prior to the origination date, prior to that disbursement date, and we probably haven't paid for a period that ends at the end of that period, but we have our next regular payroll period. We're going to be able to include all of that. So it's anything that was paid during the 8-week period or anything that was incurred during the 8-week period. Both of those get included. So this was good news for us that got clarified on the forgiveness application. And I think that is consistent with the spirit of the CARES Act. Bank account statements or third-party payroll service provider reports are what we need to document the amount of cash compensation paid to our employees. So if you have a third-party payroll service, you're going to want to get those reports. We're going to use that. If you do not have a third-party payroll service, then you're going to need to provide the bank account statements that show that we paid this payroll. If you are writing individual checks, then we may need to cancel checks too to show that it was actually payroll. So in this case, be aware of that. You may need to get canceled checks from your bank in order to do that. But you need something that proves that these checks were for payroll. So be aware of that. We're also going to need our tax forms or the equivalent third-party payroll service provider report. So this means our 941s, our quarterly payroll forms. Now, we have some churches that only have a single employee, and that single employee is the pastor. And I want to know how many of those churches we have. And so I'm going to go ahead and launch our next polling question, which is how many employees does your church have? 1 being only the pastor, 2 to 5, 6 to 9, or 10 plus. For our churches that only have the pastor, you may not have been filing historically 941s because you're not actually required to. And you may have some trouble with forgiveness without filling out a 941. So if your lender is asking for it, then you may need to fill out 941s for this period, even if you have not typically done so. And so just be aware of that it has... I think we're going to see that quite a bit, that you're going to need to file and include the 941s. Again, our churches that are pastor only are not required by the IRS to file 941s because they're not actually filing for any, if they're not filing withholdings, because they're not required to file withholdings and they do not withhold any Social Security or Medicare for the pastor, for the clergy. By the way, hopefully everybody knows that you should not be withholding Social Security or Medicare for your clergy. If you are, you're doing it wrong. That's another class, but feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about that. All right, looks like about 7% of our people on today have the pastor only on payroll. About a third of us have 10, or 36% have 10 plus. 37% are in the 2 to 5, and about 20% in the 6 to 9. So for those that are pastor only, it is possible that you will need to file the 941 that you have not been used to filing in order to get forgiveness. So just be aware of that. Now, for those of you that have what we call a PEO, or a professional employer organization, basically where you kind of have shared employees or you lease your employees, then you're going to use that Schedule R that you get from the PEO. That's the equivalent third-party payroll service provider report. And you're going to use that in lieu of the 941. So again, these are the payroll tax filings reported. Typically, that's going to be the 941. If you happen to pay any state quarterly, so this would be like unemployment, that sort of thing. Most of our churches do not. But if you happen to, you're going to include that as well. So we also need to have payment receipts and cancel checks and account statements that document the amount of any employer contributions to health insurance and retirement plans. So for us in Holston, that is largely going to be our direct bill invoices. Because we have on our direct bill invoices, we have both our health cost and we also have our pension cost there. But this could include your WestPath invoices if you have pastors that are a part of UMPIP. And it could also include evidence of payments that you made to an HSA, where the FSA is actually going to appear on the direct invoice. But if you made payments to the HSA separately, then you're going to need evidence of that as well. And so all of these things for your employer contributions related to health insurance and retirement plans, you're going to need to have these receipts or canceled checks or account statements that document that you made these payments. So again, for us in Holston, that's going to be your direct invoice. That's going to be potentially your WestPath statement and potentially evidence of any contributions you made to the HSA. Now, let me caution you. Do not make those checks to the HSA payable to the employee, i.e. the pastor in most cases. Make that check payable to the institution to which you're sending it. So, for example, Holston Methodist Federal Credit Union or wherever that HSA account is. Do not make it payable directly to the pastor would be my advice. But if you do, again, you're going to have to document all of that. All right, documentation verifying the existence of the obligations or services prior to February 15. Because you have to be able to prove for non-payroll that the service existed prior to February 15. So this means that you're going to need to have copies of whatever evidence you need. So in the case of a mortgage, then you're going to need either the lender amortization schedule or you're going to need receipts, canceled checks. You're going to need something from February 2020 as well as the months of the covered period that show the amount of the interest, because remember, the principal does not count. So that's why we need that amortization schedule or the statement or something that breaks down what was interest and what was principal, because only the interest is forgivable. For business rent, we're going to need a copy of our current lease agreement, and we're also going to need the account statements or copy of a lease agreement that showed that it was in effect on February 2020. And then we're going to need to be able to prove with receipts or canceled checks those eligible payments from the covered period. In addition, for our utility payments, we're going to need copies of our invoices from February because remember, we have to show that the service existed prior to February 15. And then we're also going to include copies of invoices, receipts, canceled checks, or account statements that verify our payments during the covered period as well. We need to maintain these records for 6 years after the date forgiven or repaid in full. So be aware of that. In many of our churches, the treasurer will change in those 6 years, or the finance chair, whoever's handling this, will change. So make sure that this documentation is at the church, secured in a file cabinet or something, and that whoever takes your place is aware of this, because the SBA can come back and audit this for up to 6 years after the date forgiven or it is repaid in full. You also need to keep documentation regarding any employee job offers and refusals, firings for cause, voluntary resignations, and written request by any employee for a reduction in work schedule. And the application itself says that compensation to owners is separated out. So let me be clear. The church does not have an owner. I can't tell you how many people reached out to me as they were filling out their applications and said, Knox, who do we put down for the owner? The church does not have an owner. The church is not something that is owned by an individual. Okay, so you don't put anybody, the pastor's salary, none of that goes in this owner's category. You're not going to include these persons at all. Now, if you happen to have another business, I gave you the amount here to include, but it's not going to be applicable for our churches. Let's talk about bookkeeping for a moment. And I am giving you my suggested bookkeeping method for this. Now, I will tell you that this is not the end all. There are multiple ways to do this. Don't fret and say Knox said this is the only way. That is not what I said. This is my suggested method. I follow the keep it simple method. Okay? So if you created a new PPP checking account or you used a separate bank account, and those of you that attended a previous webinar with me know that I recommended that you do that, then you're going to create that new PPP checking account in your software. So if you use QuickBooks or QuickBooks Online, whatever software you use, you're going to create the new checking account. I just entitle it PPP Checking. Then we're going to create a long-term liability account. Lots of people have said, but Knox, it's a short-term No, it's not a short-term liability. It is a 24-month loan. Do we anticipate it being forgiven before that? Yes, but it is a 24-month loan. By definition, 24 months is longer than a year. Anything longer than a year is a long-term liability. So we put it on our books as a long-term liability. What do I call this long-term liability? I keep it simple. PPP loan, right? Then we're going to create an other income account. Now, if you're using QuickBooks or QuickBooks Online, you're going to set this up as other miscellaneous income. And I like to entitle this one PPP loan forgiveness. Because what essentially happens is at the point where we get the forgiveness, we then incur income. We get income, right? And by the way, at that point where the forgiveness happens, that is when, if you are in Holston, I would tithe on these funds. So you're going to tithe as a part of our monthly tithing to the conference. We're going to tithe on the forgiveness amount. We don't tithe on the loan. You don't ever tithe on debt, but you do tithe on the forgiveness amount. At that point, it becomes income that was used to fill these categories that would be included in our standard operating fund. So at that point, we tithe on it. So there's been some confusion about that, I think, and I've had several emails and phone calls and Facebook messages about this as well. But it becomes income from an accounting perspective at the point where the loan is forgiven. So we're going to create an other income account. I like to just keep it simple, call it PPP loan forgiveness. And when I receive that forgiveness, then it's going to go in the PPP loan forgiveness amount on my books. And I'm going to, at that point, include it on my tithe to the conference. So this is the keep it simple method. We are going to make our bank deposit, that's the PPP disbursement, to the PPP checking account, assuming that you had that. Now, if you didn't create this second account, you can use a sub account in your books. I recommended you keep a separate bank account because it makes life simpler. But if you didn't, it's not the end of the world. And we are going to make this disbursement, charging that to the account PPP loan. Then we're going to pay expenses from the PPP checking, and we're going to debit the PPP loan for the forgiveness amount and credit PPP loan forgiveness. So we're going to do that with a journal entry, most likely. If I spoke Greek to you, your accountant should know, or your bookkeeper should understand if you just give them this page. So if you're a clergy person or something like that and didn't completely follow what I just said, the part that you need to understand is probably the part about when it becomes income and when it is tithed on. But hopefully your bookkeeper or your accountant is going to understand what I just said. All right. The next thing that we're going to do, I'm going to answer a few questions, and then I want to look at a couple of our handouts and help us to understand what is happening there. And let me look, though, quickly at a couple of our questions that are here, and I will do that. Okay. If you are having audio problems, then you probably aren't hearing me. But if you have audio or video problems at any point during the webinar, you simply need to refresh your browser. Fresh browser if audio, video problems. All right. And yes, Linda, I agree. God is the owner, not any of us. But we don't put anything there. All right. Let me see what questions we have quickly, and then we're going to dive into some others. So what constitutes a utility? So we talked about that. I answered that. Another question, full-time equivalents, is it the 30-hour-a-week average for health insurance benefits? Yes, basically it is. So it's kind of complicated the way the SBA did this, unfortunately. We used 30 hours when we look back at the 2019 period, but we actually used 40 hours when we're looking at the 2020 period. But don't overly complicate it. The bottom line is, for most of our churches, if you're 30 plus, then we can count those as full-time equivalents and be okay. Someone is asking me, are we allowed to give a bonus to employees out of the payroll protection plan? We had several members ask if we can give a small bonus to those who have kept us going during this time. So, Jessica, the answer to that is yes, you can give a small bonus out of this. That would be included in payroll cost, and you can definitely do that. You are not allowed to do this, and I'm just giving this caveat in case we have anyone on here who has other businesses. You are not allowed to do this for the business owner. But again, we don't have an owner in the church, right? So you are able to do this for your employees in the church if you choose to do that. Now, let me give the caveat: you cannot go above the 100,000. Okay, so prorated, which is 15,385. All right, but that was a good question. Good question. We have several good questions here. Someone else is saying, am I correct in saying that I can charge the Social Security and Medicare against the PPP loan, but not the portion that the church pays? What about federal taxes and state withholdings? Yeah, so everything that is included in gross payroll gets charged. So the employee side of all of that gets charged, right? So our federal and state withholdings are on the employee side. Our employee side of the Social Security and Medicare is still a part of gross payroll. So that gets included. What is not included is the employer side of the FICA. So that's 7.65%, right? That is not included. But everything that is a part of gross payroll is included. So that means that our state withholdings, our federal withholdings, our employee portion of Social Security, our employee portion of Medicare is all going to be included there. Unemployment is a non-issue for most of our church persons, but that would also be included. All right, covered utility cost. What about trash removal contracted dumpster service? Good question, Steve. The short answer is we haven't been given clear guidance on that. So I think that it probably will be included. That's my opinion, but it's an opinion because we don't have clear guidance. So what I do when I have opinions on stuff like this is I try to fill out everything I can with the stuff that is a for sure slam dunk I know is going to work. Then I throw in the maybe stuff, my opinion stuff, on the edge if I haven't gotten to the full forgiveness amount yet. So I hope that makes sense, Steve. My gut tells me that trash removal dumpster service will qualify, assuming it existed prior to February 15th, and it's an ongoing service that we are using. My gut says it will be included. However, we have not had that specific item included in any guidance that we've seen. So my gut says it will be, but again, I would use it on the edge, meaning I would fill my forgiveness with everything I could before I would use any of those edge items. If I need them, I'm going to put them in there. The worst thing that happens is it gets disallowed. All right, next question. Is the amount that a church or business pays for workers' comp a payroll cost? Barbara, the answer to that is no. That is considered in the area of property and casualty insurance as opposed to health insurance. I know that sounds weird, but it's technically property and casualty insurance, and P&C is not included. So workers' comp is not included in PPP forgiveness or allowable use for that matter. Good question, Barbara. Is in-kind housing allowance a payroll cost? No cash exchange, only shows W-2 box 14 for tax purposes. And the short answer is yes, that does get included. Yeah, so what you would put in box 14 is basically reduced on the federal side, but your pastor, your clergy person is paying self-employment tax on that actually. And that does get included. That is a part of cash compensation that we are going to include. Anything that would go in that box 14. However, a parsonage allowance, which might be what you were asking about, is a different matter. Parsonage allowance would not be because we're not paying cash for that. So when we are paying utilities, for example, at the parsonage, as a part of our, that's really a part of pastor's compensation, that gets included. When I am paying my pastor an allowance for rent or for their own home or those sorts of things, that gets included. But a parsonage that we are providing, we are not including an amount for the value of the parsonage itself in the PPP because it is not cash compensation. It's not something we're actually paying. So I hope that answered your question, Barb. I'm not sure which of those questions you were asking, so I tried to answer that both ways. If I didn't answer your question, ask a follow-up. Pastor's utilities. So I kind of just covered that, Carmen. Good question. The answer to that is if the church is paying them, then it is a part of the pastor's compensation and it is included. You would actually include that on the W-2, by the way, so I hope you are. But if the church is paying those, then it is a part of the pastor's compensation and does get included. For a utility, should I include the contract for photocopy services? Good question, Bob. So this is another of those we're not sure. My gut says that one will not work. But if you had some room on the edge, you could try it. But my gut says that your copier is not going to be considered a utility. It's going to be considered equipment, and equipment is not included. The canceled check will only show net pay. How can that be adequate support for the gross payroll we are claiming? So, Richard, part of that is going to be your 941, but you're also paying out those other items potentially. So, for example, if there's an UMPIP, if there's an HSA, if there's FSA, whatever the deductions are that you have there. And then if it's the Social Security, Medicare, state withholding, federal withholdings, those are going to be reflected on the 941 and or state equivalents. And so we're going to include those forms, and that's why, so that we can sort of add those items back in. So good question. Pastor's travel expense eligible for forgiveness as transportation? The answer to that is going to be no. So what we're talking about here is our basically Section 125 reimbursement, and the answer to that's going to be no. Those are not included in reimbursement here. Payroll does not need to be prorated for time not in the 8-week, 56-day period of the loan. That is, I think, correct, but let me clarify. Any pay that is paid during the period is included. Any pay that is incurred during the period is included. So what that means is that we actually get more than 8 weeks of real payroll that we get to include for most of us, because we probably have a pay period that is before the 8-week period, but our check falls in the 8-week period, and or we probably have a pay period at the end of our 8-week period in which we have not paid, but we have accrued some payroll. We get to include both of those. It's everything that is incurred or accrued during the period, as well as everything that we pay during the period related to payroll cost. So I hope that answers your question. All right. I think you mentioned this, but I didn't catch it. Is reimbursements to employees for their own health insurance policy counted towards the forgiveness? No, it is not. Has to be a group health plan in order to be counted for forgiveness. All right. What if we pay our pastor for the month of May at the end of April and we get PPP funding during the month of May? Is that considered incurred or not, since it's already been paid? This is a gray area. The short answer is I would probably not try to include it, assuming I could get all of the forgiveness. But if you're consistent, you're still going to get 2 months of payroll in there, right? And possibly 3 if you do it just right. So you're probably going to be able to work that in such a way that you don't need it. But if you need it, you can try it. So technically it would be incurred, I suppose. All right. Personal property lease payments are allowed. Therefore, a copier lease is allowed, correct? I do not think so. No. I do not think so. Personal property lease payments are allowed for self-employed persons on a Schedule C. Churches are not self-employed. Churches are not on a Schedule C. So, no, I don't think so. Will we have to show any income? We're still receiving money from the congregation, but maybe at 80% of normal levels. Payroll is our largest expense, but with this PPP income, we're coming out with a surplus right now. So actually, I'm not entirely sure what you're asking me about. Where will you have to show any income? So you need to ask me a follow-up. Are you asking me, do you have to show income for the forgiveness piece? If that's your question, the answer is no. Income is irrelevant for the forgiveness piece. If you're asking me about tithing to the conference, that's another question, so ask a follow-up. On a previous webinar, I mentioned that a security system might be classified as a utility. Can I clarify? Again, if it's a security service, then I think that could be classified as a utility if it were in existence prior to February 15. Now, if we're talking about equipment, that's not going to be included, I don't think. But if we're talking about the monitoring service, then that, I think, is going to be considered a utility. So, Vicky, I hope that helps. Holston Conference direct billing does not give a breakdown between employer contributions and employee payments. How will you show your approving bank the forgivable amount? So the short answer is I'm going to suggest that you provide a spreadsheet to answer that. And I will also have a chat with the benefits officer and see if we can maybe do something about that, because we really do need to show that breakdown. So I believe, let me see if she's on with us today. Not sure that they were on earlier. I think they might have fallen off. So I'll reach out and see what we can do about that. But the short answer is you're going to show a spreadsheet breakdown if that doesn't get fixed. And I'm not sure if it can be or not, because that may be a software issue. If the church pays an outside service to complete their payroll, are the fees forgivable? I would say yes, that's included as a payroll cost, essentially. The rate sheet will take care of this. Awesome. So Rick Cherry happens to be on with us today, and Rick offered a great suggestion. Include the rate sheet that shows the breakdown. And so if you include that along with the direct invoice, then that should take care of it. Thank you, Rick. All right, good. We've got a couple of other questions, and I am going to dive in. I'm going to come back to those, but I want to follow up with a couple of other things that I want to show real quickly before we dive too much further in. And then we will come back. So one of the things that I included for you is a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet that is included is not my own. It's actually from the AICPA, which is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. So I didn't create it, so I can't take credit for it. But it's a fairly good one. And basically what you're going to want to do is only fill in the blue areas. And the instructions are pretty simple, but this will help you to do that. But be aware that payroll costs does include the housing allowance when you do that. But what I want to show now is actually the application itself. So let me switch the screen here and move to the application. And I want to go through this a little bit. All right, so the application should be coming up shortly on your screen. It's probably switching over about now. Yes, someone is asking, is the income from part-time employees eligible for forgiveness? The answer to that is yes. All of your employees count. Okay, the application is a little daunting. Good news, bad news. It is 11 pages long, including the instructions. So you can see it on your screen. And I don't want you to just get overwhelmed and throw up your hat and don't do it, because this is important for our churches to get this forgiveness. So I want to walk you through how we are going to complete this application. We actually get all the way to page 3 before it begins. The business legal name is the name of your church. Most of our churches are not incorporated. If you happen to be incorporated, you're going to include your incorporated name. But for example, my church where I serve is Auburn United Methodist Church. So I would write here, Auburn United Methodist Church. The business address is not your personal address. The business address is the business address. The business TIN is not your social. It is the church's EIN. And then the business phone, primary contact probably is you, and email address should be your email address for the primary contact. Then you're going to include your SBA PPP loan number and your lender PPP loan number. You should be able to find these on the documents that you signed, which hopefully you were given a copy of, whether that was DocuSign or however you sign those. You should have a copy, and you should be able to pull these from those documents. If you're not able to, reach out to your lender and they can find them for you. Your loan amount is obvious. Your loan disbursement date is the date that it hit your application. I mean, the date it hit your bank account, the date the money hit your bank account. The employees at the time of the loan application, that's pretty self-explanatory. How many employees did you have on payroll when you did your application? Go back and look at what you printed on your application, because these numbers should match. And then employees at the time of the forgiveness application. So that's the number of employees you have when you're filling this out. If you received an EIDL advance of $1,000 per employee, you're going to put that here. And then you're going to put that application number. And remember, your forgiveness will be reduced by that amount. Then you're going to put your payroll schedule. Do you pay weekly? Do you pay every other week? Do you pay twice a month? Do you pay monthly? Or do you pay in some other configuration? So my church, for example, would actually be both twice a month and monthly. So we would check 2 of these boxes. Our covered period. Our covered period is going to be the date that the disbursement happened and 8 weeks later. Our alternative payroll covered period. Now, I haven't overly talked about this, but we have the ability to use an alternative payroll covered period. What we do in this case is we start our covered period for payroll purposes on the date of our first payroll run during the covered period. And then we run an 8-week period starting on that date. This is an option. If you want to do that, you can. And in this case, you're going to choose an alternative payroll covered period. I will tell you that it makes the calculation slightly more complex if you do that. So just be aware of that, but you do have that option. Then what you're going to do is if your loan was in excess of $2 million, you're going to check this box. Please do not check this box unless your loan is greater than $2 million, which is almost none of our churches. Okay? All right. So do not check that box. For 99% of you, do not check that box. The forgiveness amount calculation is where we're going to put together all of our payroll costs. But notice that it says we're going to pull these from Schedule A. So we're not just going to put these here. We're going to have to go calculate these other places, right? And I'll show you that in a minute. Then we're going to add our mortgage interest. Remember, only the interest. We're going to put that there during the covered period if we have any. Our rent, if we have any, during the covered period. And our utility payments during the covered period. Again, this is the total. Don't do anything with line 5, 6, or 7 unless the spreadsheet or the schedule that I am providing to you tell you that you have to. We're going to hope to avoid these because we do not want to have to make an adjustment because we didn't have enough full-time equivalents and or we didn't have enough salary paid out. We hope to avoid that. But if you do, then you're going to have a problem. Now, line 9 is very, very simple. Line 9 is where we're going to put the loan amount. And line 10 is simply line 1 times 75%. So we're going to look at what is our total of payroll cost, divide that by 0.75, and basically we're going to make sure that it's 75% of our forgiveness. But that's the limitation. And then that's going to ultimately tell us our forgiveness amount. Now, my recommendation to you is that you print this out. I've provided it for you, and you fill this out in pencil first. Then you're going to type this, I would suggest, before you turn it into the bank. But fill this out in pencil first, and you want to make sure you have it right and maximize your forgiveness before you turn this in. And double check your math. Please don't turn in applications that don't have correct math. So this means get someone else in your church to double check your work. So if you're the treasurer, maybe get the finance chair, the board chair, pastor if you have to, finance secretary, get somebody else to double look over it and make sure everything looks good. Then the person who is signing, and by the way, this in theory should be the same person that signed for the loan. You're going to initial each of these line items. The first one basically says that I spent this the way I was supposed to, right? The second one says, I spent this the way I was supposed to. The third one says, I spent this the way I was supposed to. Are you seeing the theme here? Now, these are worded different ways, right? But essentially, you're saying, I did what I was supposed to do. Then you're saying, I have provided adequate documentation. Then you're saying, everything I put in this application is correct. Then you're saying the 941s that I've submitted are consistent with the ones that I'm sending the IRS. And then you're saying, I understand that the SBA can come back and ask me for more information. You're going to sign, you're going to print your name, date, and your title. Treasurer, finance chair, church council chair, whatever the case may be. Then we're going to look for Schedule A. So these are the instructions for Schedule A. and here's Schedule A. Now, we have to complete Schedule A before we complete what appeared before it. I know that sounds weird, but that's kind of the way it works. So we're going to enter our cash compensation from Table 1. So what does that tell us? Well, we got to go complete Table 1 first, right? So we have to complete the worksheet. But none of this is too complex. And actually, the spreadsheet that I provided you will help you do all of this. So I suggest you use the spreadsheet first and then go from the spreadsheet to this. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to ask. But I wanted to make sure that you were able to see that before we got started or before we went any further. So I'm going to come back and look at some more questions. But before we do that, I'm going to launch our last polling question. This polling question just asking if this webinar has been helpful or not. And I'll give you a moment to answer that. And while you're answering that, I will dive back into some of the Q&A. So please say more about the EIDL amount being deducted. When did that come in? Okay, just now. So if you receive the EIDL, that's that grant, the advance, the $1,000 per employee, then that was already a grant, meaning you already received some forgiveness for that. So it basically is going to deduct the forgiveness amount that you're receiving as a part of the PPP because your maximum amount is what's in the PPP. So if you got an advance, you basically got an advance on the loan up front from the EIDL, then it's simply going to reduce the amount of forgiveness you have now because you already received that money up front as an advance. So hopefully, Eric, that helped to answer your question. If I received my loan on 4/17, but my 4/1 to 4/30 payroll was paid on 4/15, what is allowed to be forgiven? The entire month or only 4/17 to 4/30? Only 4/17 to 4/30 because you did not pay it within the covered period, but the 4/17 to 4/30, it was accrued. And so, or it was incurred. And so your 4/17 to 4/30 payroll could be forgiven, but not prior to the disbursement date because you paid it prior to that. Now, if you had paid it on the 17th, then it would all be eligible. So interesting kind of the way that works. So Sarah, I hope that answered your question. Okay, she says we paid April benefits such as the 4/1 to 4/30 health insurance at the end of March. We received our loan on April 17. Are we allowed to submit the portion of the health insurance from 4/17 to 4/30 even though it was paid in March? Yes, you could. You could do that. However, you may not need it when you actually run all of your calculations because if you consistently are doing that, you're going to get a couple of months in there anyway. So you may not need it. So if you need it, you certainly could. But make it as simple for the bank as you can would be my advice, as long as you're still maximizing your forgiveness. If you have an employee who was under $100,000 for 2019 but will go over in 2020, do we limit them for forgiveness? The application seems to indicate for 2019, yeah, you cannot pay more than $100,000 during the covered period and have more than $100,000 be forgiven. So you can have up to $100,000 be forgiven, but not more than. For that particular employee. That's prorated, so that's $15,385 for the covered period. We pay monthly currently. There's only one payday during the 8-week period. Can we move the second monthly payday period 1 week to be in the 8-week period? So, yes, you could potentially use that alternative payment cycle payroll cycle that we talked about, the alternative payroll covered period. You could potentially do that. Can you review copy or lease payments forgivable? I do not think they're going to be forgivable. I don't know how to say that any clearer. Can we take in $80,000 so we take in $80,000 this month. Our PPP expenses covered are $50,000. Well, let me back up to the previous question. I'm talking about for churches right now. If I'm doing a broader webinar, it is going to be forgivable for self-employed persons, but not for churches, okay? Churches are not in the self-employment Schedule C category, so I don't think it's going to be forgivable for churches. Now, could you try to put it in on the edge if you're not able to get to your full forgiveness amount? Possibly, but that would be an edge item. because I can't get to forgiveness, so I'm going to put it in there, maybe, but definitely not as one of my primary things. Will there be a link to share with staff who are unable to watch the webinar at this time who would benefit from watching it later? Yes, we will put this up on the Holston Conference website after Tuesday. It'll probably be Wednesday when it goes up, because we're doing another one of these Tuesday night. And that's the other thing. If you have someone who would like to register for Tuesday night, then they can go to the site and register for Tuesday night. We'll be doing this again on Tuesday evening. So, but after that, a recording will go on the Holston Conference website, somewhere linked, and I'm sure Tim will send out that information. Someone is saying, so we take in $80,000 this month. Our PPP expenses are $50,000 and the non-PP covered are $50,000. We came out with a $30,000 surplus. Are we still okay to accept the funds and use them? The answer to that is yes. So when you took out the loan, you had to answer a question that asked, do you have economic uncertainty? As long as you could answer at that time that you had economic uncertainty, which my church certainly did. Now we're thankfully doing okay right now, but we definitely had economic uncertainty when we first took this thing out because we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how long we were going to be closed. At the time, our offerings were way, way down since they have improved, thankfully. But at the time, we were way off. And so we had economic uncertainty. So if you had economic uncertainty at the time of the application, then you were eligible to take the loan and to use the loan and qualify for the forgiveness. So the answer to that is yes, you're okay to accept the funds and use them, and you should, in my opinion. Is the income from part-time employees with less than 30 hours a week eligible for forgiveness? The answer to that is yes, it is. We heat and cool the church with propane. Can the church include the cost of filling our propane tanks as utility cost? I would say yes, as long as it is a propane service that comes out. And you can show a history that they did that prior to February 15th as well. We received a paper check that was issued on 5/1 and was deposited on 5/6 to our account. Which date do we use to start the 8 weeks? Wow, you're the first one I've heard where the bank issued a paper check and didn't ACH deposit it. That's weird. That's a great question. The short answer is it is probably the date that the check was issued. So I would probably start it on 5/1. Alternatively, you could reach out. One of the questions would be, does it make a difference? But you could also use an alternative payroll cycle just to sort of clarify things. And in your case, I would do that. Use an alternative payroll cycle and make it clear that way. That is the only bank. Send me a private chat and let me know what bank that is. I'm really curious because I have not heard of any doing that. When I download the spreadsheet you provided, all that downloads is the first page. Is there some way to download the entire package? There are tabs on the bottom of the spreadsheet. Should be. So you should be able to see the entire spreadsheet if you switch the tabs. If you're not able to, then email me, and I am happy to email you the spreadsheet if you're unable to get it. Someone else asking, how do we handle employees that are seasonal, like preschool teachers? The 8 weeks will extend past when school ends, and teachers would not be paid during the summer. So I think that's not going to be an issue. You should be able to match the previous period from 2019 similarly. And so your full-time equivalents that you're going to have should match. And remember, you're also allowed to have a 25% reduction. So I would make sure that I do not exceed the 25% reduction. That's part A. And assuming I'm not exceeding the 25% reduction, I wouldn't worry about it. That's my answer to that. All right. I think we have actually answered all of the chat questions. Or the Q&A questions. So with that, we are going to, looks like I have one that was sent to me by chat. Someone asking on rent. Does this include rent on buildings? The answer to that would be yes. If you have a lease agreement on a building that was in effect prior to February 15th, this absolutely could. Even if it's a warehouse or something like that, that could still be included. All right, we are going to, let's see, someone is saying clergy base is less than 100. Cash housing allowance paid to clergy puts it over 100. Are we limited to 100? Yes, you are, Tom. You're limited to the 100. So 100 is the maximum that you can include for gross compensation, and that is going to be included in gross. It's considered a cash equivalent. So 100 is the max. So there is going to be a limitation there. Part-time employee decides not to come back. Does that cause any reduction other than the payroll costs not being paid? The answer to that is generally no, as long as you remain above the 75%. And I would also document, by the way, that they chose not to come back. Remember that documentation we talked about? Written offer for rehire, and they document that they chose not to come back. So go ahead and do that to protect yourself. If we only applied for the EIDL grant and not the PPP, do we have to file anything about the grant? No, you do not. To clarify, we did not actually pay the employees until after we received the money, but the expenses were incurred during the month, so we can use it, right? Yes, if you paid the employees after you received the money, then you paid them during the incurred period, you can use that. Absolutely. Yep, anything you paid during the covered period, even if it's for payroll prior to, you are good to include. Not a problem at all. So, Roberta, I'm not sure that I understand your question. So, this is going to be lease on your building that you're in, storage facility, warehouse, those sorts of things. So, yes, buildings is what we're talking about for rent. So hopefully that helped clarify there. The paper check. Okay, cool. All right. That's interesting. Even most of the banks where you didn't have an account there still send an ACH to the bank account you specified. So very interesting to me. Banks must reply to us within 60 days of receipt of our application, correct? That is correct. Is there a deadline for us to submit to the bank, even though we would want to as soon as possible to avoid more interest accrued? The short answer to that is you want to as soon as you can. I suggest within 10 days of the end of your period. Some people may extend a little beyond that if you are waiting for your next payroll, but you want to submit as soon as you can because you don't want that payment to start. Remember, you have a 6-month deferment, and you don't want that payment to start before you have your forgiveness. So you definitely want to do that. To clarify, the employee portion is allowed for forgiveness. The employer portion is not. That is correct, Diana. That is correct. All right. Looks like we have some more questions that have come in. That's good. Is prepaying utilities for cost smoothing allowed? We don't have a definitive answer to that, but I can tell you that my opinion is it will be. And I can tell you that if there's any room left at my church, we will be doing that. That is one of the strategies we will be employing. So my answer to that is I would absolutely do that if you have room left on the edge. Is it okay to use 100% on payroll? Yes, Lisa, it is okay. The primary purpose of these loans is payroll. Our church only applied for the EIDL. Do we have to fill a form? No, you do not. When do we tithe on the grant? As soon as you receive it. So if you received it, go ahead and tithe on it. Banks must reply to us within 60 days. All right, I already answered that. I believe. Sorry, trying to grab these questions that are coming in, and I try to mark them answered so I don't ask them again. I was told that the total payroll amount had to be issued within the 8-week period we pay monthly. So to account for the 2.5, I was told to adjust the pay dates to ensure basically I'll be paying ahead of time. You can do that. And Walter, that was actually my advice until the 15th when the new application came out and gave us the leeway of saying paid or incurred, which I think is consistent with the law, by the way, but was not consistent with the FAQ. So you can do either, but paying it within the 8 weeks is perfectly fine. Okay, looks like that question got asked twice. Can I clarify what I just said about prepaying utilities? Don't they need to be incurred and paid? No, it's incurred or paid. So it includes everything that's been incurred and it includes everything that's been paid. We applied for the PPP loan and included the pastor's salary, but when we received the loan money, the pastor's salary was not included. because the pastor was considered self-employed. It's my understanding the pastor's salary was included. Can the pastor apply for themselves? No. Linda, the pastor is not self-employed. The pastor is an employee and receives a W-2, and your bank simply did not understand it. So you need to go back to the bank and let them know that they did not understand it and provide for them some of the guidelines and directions that are included in some of the material that I gave for you today. When is the next PPP Forgiveness Churches in time? I will look that up for you in just a minute, Wayne, but it's Tuesday evening. I want to say 6:30. Regarding direct billed health insurance, please clarify employer portion is allowed. Employee portion is allowed. It's actually all allowed because the employee portion is a part of gross payroll, but you can't double count it. That's the issue. So you're going to include in the gross payroll the employee portion, but then you're going to include in the employer paid for health benefits the employer portion. Does that make sense? Hopefully, Diana. All right, let me look up when the next PPP Forgiveness for Churches time is. I think it's 6:30 Tuesday evening Eastern, but let me look that up to make sure that yes, Tuesday, May the 6th at 6:30 is the time for that. And I will give you a link in the chat. So if you need to share that link with anyone, you can. That is a link to register for that. Okay, I think we have answered. Let me make sure no other questions have come in. Is incurred and paid the same for health insurance benefits? Yes, it is. Our first payroll was not paid from the PPP account. Should all other payrolls come directly from that account, or should we continue to transfer funds from the PPP account to the general fund? You can handle it either way, Marty. Either way is okay. Back to the utilities. If we paid a bill for the period prior to incurred, we can deduct the entire thing. Yes, if you paid it during the covered period. That is correct, Sarah. All right. I think we have gotten through all of our questions. I did not look through the chat, so hopefully I didn't look through all of the chat. If there were questions there, I may have missed them, but I did look through all of the Q&A. So I want to thank you for being a part. For those of you that are clergy, we will send after the Tuesday night webinar, I'll wait and just compile it all, and we will send that information to Sue Weber for your CEUs. It does qualify for 0.1 CEUs. Other than that, this webinar has been provided by the Holston Conference Council on Finance and Administration, commonly known as CFA. So if you appreciated this, then remember that we're here for you, and we try to do everything we can to help our churches during this time. With that, God bless, take care, and we'll see you next time.